January 17, 1946, Okinawa Prefecture, southern Japan. The winter air hung heavy over the village of Shimabuku, a cluster of weathered wooden houses tucked between terraced rice paddies that had gone fallow for 2 seasons. Smoke no longer rose from cooking fires. The smell of salt and decay drifted inland from the East China Sea, mixing with the earthen scent of turned soil that would yield no harvest. In the narrow dirt pathways between homes, children sat motionless, their swollen bellies pressing against threadbare clothing, their eyes following the movements of adults with the dull recognition of creatures who had learned not to expect food. An old woman knelt beside a wooden bucket, her hands trembling as she scooped water mixed with rice bran, the only substance left after the precious grains had been rationed and re-rationed until nothing remained but dust. She brought the cloudy liquid to her lips, paused, then lowered it. Even this would be gone by nightfall. In the distance, the sound of diesel engines growled through the morning mist, a mechanical intrusion into a landscape that had known only human voices and the whisper of wind through bamboo for centuries. The villagers did not run. They had nowhere left to go. The war had ended 4 months earlier, but for the people of Shimabuku, the collapse had begun long before the emperor's surrender. By 1944, as American forces tightened their grip on the Pacific, the Japanese Imperial Army had systematically stripped Okinawa of every resource. Rice stores were seized for the military. Livestock was slaughtered to feed garrison troops. Young men were conscripted into the Boitai * defense units, and those who remained were ordered to prepare for the final battle, Ketsugo *, the decisive homeland defense that would turn every citizen into a weapon. The elderly were taught to sharpen bamboo spears. Mothers were instructed to hold grenades against their children rather than allow capture by the American devils who, they were told, would rape, torture, and desecrate everything they touched. When the Battle of Okinawa erupted in April 1945, Shimabuku found itself in the path of total war. American naval bombardment turned the surrounding hillsides into moonscapes. Japanese artillery answered from hidden caves, and the village became a no-man's land where survival meant burrowing into tombs and ditches, emerging only when the shelling paused. By June, when organized Japanese resistance collapsed, more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians had perished, 1/3 of the island's population. Shimabuku had lost 42 of its 200 residents. The survivors emerged into a world stripped bare, where the machinery of sustenance had been obliterated. The occupation that followed brought not relief but confusion. American forces established control, but the logistics of feeding a shattered civilian population lagged behind military priorities. Distribution systems broke down. Black markets flourished in the cities, but in remote villages like Shimabuku, there was nothing to buy and no currency to buy it with. The rice paddies, poisoned by salt water and neglect, would take years to recover. Fishing boats had been sunk or commandeered. The forests had been burned. Every day became an exercise in surviving until the next day, and the next, with no promise that either would come. The children stopped playing. The women stopped singing the old songs. The men who returned from labor conscription sat in doorways, their eyes fixed on nothing, their minds circling the same impossible question. How do you feed a family when there is no food, no seed, no hope of harvest? Some villages resorted to eating tree bark and grass. Others consumed the seed rice that was meant for spring planting, trading future survival for one more week of present existence. In Shimabuku, the headman had rationed the last stores down to a spoonful of grain per person per day, then half a spoonful, then nothing. By mid-January, the village was dying. This was the world the American soldiers entered on that cold winter morning. The convoy consisted of 3 trucks, dusty olive-green vehicles marked with white stars, their cargo beds covered with canvas tarps. They rumbled to a stop at the village edge, engines idling, exhaust clouding in the winter air. For a long moment, nothing happened. The soldiers inside seemed to be conferring, voices muffled by distance and the growl of diesel. The villagers watched from doorways and windows, their faces expressionless. Some clutched children closer. Others simply waited, too exhausted for fear. The soldiers who emerged were not what Japanese propaganda had promised. They were young. Some looked barely 18, with sunburned faces and uniforms that seemed too clean, too new, as if they had been issued yesterday. They moved with a casual confidence that was neither aggressive nor apologetic, a demeanor that confused the watching villagers who had been taught to expect monsters. One soldier carried a rifle slung over his shoulder. Another held a clipboard. A third stood by the truck's tailgate, waiting. The sergeant in charge, a stocky man with a Kansas drawl and 3 stripes on his sleeve, approached the center of the village and called out in broken Japanese, the words mangled but the intent clear. "Food, we have food." He gestured toward the trucks. The villagers did not move. The children stared. The old woman with the bucket set it down slowly, her hands still trembling. What the villagers could not have known, what they could not have imagined in their years of indoctrination and isolation, was that these American soldiers were part of a broader occupation policy that defied every expectation the Japanese military leadership had held. While Tokyo prepared for a brutal invasion that would justify atrocities in the name of defense, while commanders stockpiled poison gas and planned suicide charges, the American High Command had spent months preparing for something different. Reconstruction. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation directives, drafted even before the Japanese surrender, included detailed provisions for civilian relief. The United States, despite having waged a campaign of firebombing and atomic destruction, had allocated resources to feed the defeated enemy. Warehouses in Okinawa and the main islands were stocked with rice, flour, canned goods, and medical supplies, not as charity, but as policy. The logic was strategic. A starving population would breed resentment, instability, and communist insurgency. But the execution at the ground level carried an emotional weight that no policy document could have predicted. The sergeant gestured again. 2 soldiers moved to the back of the lead truck and pulled the tarp aside. Inside were crates, dozens of them, stacked and labeled with stenciled letters. The soldiers began unloading them, setting them on the ground with a careful deliberacy. One crate was pried open. Inside, cans. Rows and rows of tin cans, each bearing colorful labels depicting fruits, vegetables, meats. Another crate held sacks of rice, white and polished, tied with twine. A third contained loaves of bread wrapped in wax paper, still soft despite the journey. The headman of Shimobuku, a thin man in his 60s with a graying beard and eyes sunken from hunger, stepped forward cautiously. He bowed, a reflex born of decades of social conditioning, and the sergeant awkwardly returned the gesture. The headman spoke in Japanese, his voice hoarse. "Why do you do this?" The sergeant did not understand the words, but he understood the question. He shrugged and replied in English, knowing the meaning would be lost but the tone would carry. "Because you're hungry." The unloading continued. The soldiers worked quickly, efficiently, but without the coldness of military routine. One young private, red-haired and freckled, knelt beside a child, a girl of perhaps 5, her legs thin as sticks, and offered her a chocolate bar. She recoiled, pressing herself against her mother's leg. The mother's face was a mask of confusion and fear. The soldier placed the chocolate on the ground in front of the child and stepped back, smiling. The girl stared at the brown rectangle as if it were a bomb. This moment, this simple transaction of food given without demand or threat, represented a fracture in the ideological architecture that had sustained the Japanese Empire. For years, the population had been taught that Americans were subhuman barbarians, that they would defile temples, enslave women, and exterminate the race. Military indoctrination films showed American soldiers bayoneting infants, laughing as cities burned. School children were drilled with the slogan, 100 million will die for the emperor. The logic was absolute. Death was preferable to surrender, and surrender to Americans was a fate worse than any death imaginable. Yet here were the barbarians, unloading canned peaches. The cognitive dissonance was not immediate. Decades of propaganda cannot be erased by a crate of food. The villagers accepted the supplies with bowed heads and murmured thanks, but their eyes remained guarded. Some refused to eat in front of the soldiers, taking the cans back to their homes where they could be opened in private, examined, tested. Rumors had circulated of poisoned food drops, of supplies booby-trapped to explode. Trust was not given. It had to be earned gram by gram, meal by meal. But hunger is a relentless teacher. By evening, the smell of cooking filled Shimabuku for the first time in months. Fires were lit. Cans were opened with shaking hands. Canned ham, canned corn, canned milk thick and sweet. The rice was boiled in salvaged pots, and the steam rose like prayers into the winter sky. Children ate until their stomachs ached, then vomited, then ate again, their bodies struggling to remember how to process nourishment. The old woman who had scooped rice bran water that morning sat with a bowl of real rice, tears streaming down her weathered face, her hands clutching the bowl as if it might vanish. The soldiers did not leave. They set up a temporary camp at the village edge, their tents arranged in neat rows, a portable generator humming to power lights and a field kitchen. Over the following days, they returned with more supplies. Blankets, medicine, water purification tablets. A medic treated infected wounds and administered vaccinations. A chaplain, unsure of how to navigate the religious landscape, simply sat with the villagers and shared meals, his presence a quiet assertion that they were seen, that they mattered. The transformation was not immediate, but it was irreversible. The children, initially wary, began to approach the camp. The red-haired private became a fixture, teaching them simple English words, apple, thank you, friend, while they taught him Japanese phrases he would mangle with endearing incompetence. The headman, cautious but pragmatic, began to coordinate with the sergeant, identifying the village's most urgent needs. Seed rice for planting, tools to repair the paddies, lumber to rebuild homes damaged in the battle. What emerged in Shimabuku was a microcosm of a broader, bewildering reality that was unfolding across Japan. The Americans, rather than exacting vengeance, were rebuilding. Schools were reopened. Hospitals were constructed. Land reform was imposed, breaking the power of absentee landlords and distributing property to tenant farmers. Women were granted the right to vote. Labor unions were legalized. The occupation, for all its complexities and contradictions, was not the apocalypse the Japanese military had promised. It was something stranger and more disorienting. It was reconstruction with a human face. The symbolic weight of food in this transformation cannot be overstated. In Japanese culture, rice was not merely sustenance. It was identity, the literal staff of life, the offering placed before ancestors, the measure of wealth and stability. To be without rice was to be without humanity. The American distribution of rice, and not just rice, but an abundance that seemed almost wasteful, almost obscene, struck at the heart of Japanese wartime propaganda. The enemy was not starving them, the enemy was feeding them. The enemy was not enslaving them, the enemy was teaching their children. The enemy was not destroying their culture, the enemy was asking them to rebuild it. For the soldiers, many of whom were farm boys from Iowa and Texas, the experience was equally disorienting. They had been trained to kill Japanese soldiers, to view the enemy as fanatics who would never surrender, who would fight with swords and bamboo spears until the last man fell. They had landed on Okinawa expecting a bloodbath, and they had received one, with American casualties exceeding 48,000. The psychological scars of that battle, the memories of kamikaze attacks and banzai charges, did not vanish with the emperor's surrender. Yet here they were, playing with children, sharing rations, watching old women weep over bowls of rice. The letters home reflected the confusion. I thought I'd hate them, wrote a corporal from Ohio to his mother. "I thought they'd be monsters. But they're just people, hungry, scared people. The kids look like my little sister. How do you hate someone who looks like your sister?" Another soldier, a farm boy from Nebraska, wrote, "We gave them seed corn yesterday." The old men cried. Grown men crying over seeds. Made me think of Pa, how he'd feel if someone took our harvest. Makes you wonder what the hell we're all doing. This wondering, this quiet questioning, was the crack in the ideological edifice on both sides. War demands absolutes. Us versus them, good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism. But the occupation of Shimabuku, and thousands of villages like it, introduced nuance into a narrative that had allowed no room for nuance. The Americans were not saints. The occupation included instances of violence, exploitation, and cultural insensitivity. But they were also not devils. They were, improbably, unexpectedly human. As winter gave way to spring, Shimabuku began to heal. The rice paddies, cleared of debris and carefully irrigated, were planted with the American-supplied seed. The first green shoots emerged in March, slender and fragile, but undeniably alive. Children returned to a makeshift school set up in a repaired temple, where a young Okinawan teacher, trained by American education officers, taught reading and arithmetic alongside traditional calligraphy. The village's population, which had dwindled to 158 by January, stabilized. Slowly, refugees who had fled to the hills returned, drawn by rumors of food and safety. The soldiers rotated out, replaced by new units, but the pattern held. The camp became a fixture, a strange hybrid space where American efficiency met Okinawan resilience. The red-haired private, whose name was Thomas O'Reilly, was reassigned to the Philippines, but not before the village children gave him a farewell gift. A small wooden carving of a dragon, painted in bright colors, a symbol of protection. He wept when he received it, though he tried to hide his tears. The headman, who had spent the war years expecting death and had survived to see something stranger than death or victory, began to articulate a thought that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He spoke it first to his wife late at night when the house was quiet and the risk of being overheard was minimal. "They are not what we were told," he said. "They are not demons. Perhaps," he paused, the words heavy and dangerous, "perhaps we were lied to." His wife said nothing, but her silence was agreement. This realization, that the state had lied, that the military had lied, that the entire apparatus of propaganda and control had been built on falsehoods, rippled through Japan like a slow earthquake. It did not happen overnight. Many refused to accept it, clinging to the old narratives because the alternative was too painful. To admit that the Americans were not barbarians was to admit that the sacrifices, the millions of dead, the burned cities, the children trained to die with grenades, had been based on lies. For some, this admission was impossible. They retreated into bitterness, into conspiracy theories, into the belief that the surrender had been a betrayal rather than a salvation. But for others, particularly the young and the desperate, the evidence was undeniable. The Americans were feeding them. The Americans were rebuilding schools. The Americans were not raping and pillaging. They were handing out chocolate. The cognitive dissonance resolved itself in the only way it could. The old ideology collapsed, and something new, fragile, and uncertain took its place. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was, fittingly, the can. The tin can, with its colorful label and its promise of preserved abundance, became a marker of the occupation's strangeness. Japanese civilians had lived through years of scarcity, of rations reduced and reduced again, until nothing remained but propaganda and promises. The sight of American soldiers casually discarding half-eaten cans of food, throwing them away as if they were worthless, was shocking, almost obscene. Abundance was not something to be hoarded or rationed. It was something to be assumed, expected, wasted. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of an industrial capacity that Japan, for all its military fervor, had never matched. The United States produced more steel, more oil, more food, more of everything than any nation in history. Its soldiers ate better in the field than most Japanese civilians had eaten in peacetime. The sea ration, derided by American troops as monotonous and barely palatable, contained more calories and nutrition than the average Japanese civilian had seen in months. The sheer scale of American material wealth was a weapon more devastating than any bomb, because it made the privations of Japanese wartime existence undeniable. In Shimabuku, the cans accumulated. At first, villagers hoarded them, using the tins as containers for nails, seeds, water. But as the deliveries continued, week after week, month after month, the cans became commonplace. Children used them as toys, rolling them down hills, banging them like drums. The old woman who had wept over rice now used a repurposed can to measure grain for planting. The headman stacked them in a shed, a physical reminder of the strange new world they inhabited. By summer, the rice paddies were lush. The harvest would not be large, but it would exist. The village held a small festival, a modest affair compared to the pre-war celebrations, but significant nonetheless. There was music, the hesitant plucking of a shamisen, and children danced in the firelight. The American soldiers were invited. Some attended, sitting awkwardly on the ground, accepting cups of weak tea, trying to communicate with hand gestures and broken phrases. The sergeant, now a veteran of 6 months in Shimabuku, gave a short speech that no one understood but everyone applauded. The headman responded in Japanese, his words equally opaque to the Americans, but the tone was clear. Gratitude, cautious hope, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the world had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The story of Shimabuku is not unique. Across Okinawa, across Kyushu, across the main islands of Honshu and Hokkaido, similar scenes played out. Villages that had been taught to fear the American invasion instead found themselves recipients of aid. The scale of the relief effort was staggering. By 1946, the United States was shipping over 3 million tons of food into Japan annually. The cost was borne by American taxpayers, many of whom questioned why they should feed the enemy. But the policy held, driven by a mixture of humanitarian impulse, strategic calculation, and the recognition that stability in Japan served American interests. The Japanese government, humiliated and occupied, struggled to reconcile the reality of American aid with the ideology that had justified the war. Emperor Hirohito, in his New Year's rescript of 1946, declared that he was not a god, a statement that shattered the foundation of state Shinto and the imperial cult. The fiction of divine rule, which had been used to justify obedience, sacrifice, and death, was dismantled in a single sentence. For millions of Japanese, this was the final unraveling. If the emperor was not a god, if the Americans were not demons, then what had the war been for? The answer, articulated slowly and painfully over the following decades, was that the war had been a catastrophic error born of militarism, propaganda, and the concentration of power in the hands of ideologues who valued ideology over human life. This reckoning was neither swift nor complete. War criminals were tried and executed, but many escaped justice. The imperial family retained symbolic status, shielded by American concerns about stability. The cultural memory of the war became contested terrain, with competing narratives of victimhood, guilt, and redemption. But in villages like Shimabuku, the reckoning was simpler and more immediate. The Americans had come with food. The Americans had not killed them. The Americans had treated them, if not as equals, then at least as human beings deserving of life. This basic decency, so stark in contrast to the years of privation and propaganda, became the foundation for a new relationship, one built not on conquest or revenge, but on the fragile possibility of coexistence. The transformation was not confined to Japan. The American soldiers who served in the occupation returned home changed. They had seen the consequences of total war, the way ideology could drive entire societies to self-destruction. They had seen children starve and old women weep and men broken by years of futile sacrifice. Many carried those memories for the rest of their lives, and many questioned the narratives of triumph and glory that defined the war in American culture. The occupation, for all its flaws, had taught them that the enemy was not a monolith, not a horde of fanatics, but a collection of individuals, mothers, fathers, children, who had been caught in the machinery of a war they did not choose. Thomas O'Reilly, the red-haired private, returned to Boston in 1947. He kept the wooden dragon carving on his desk for 50 years, and when asked about his service, he would tell the story of Shimabuku, the village that had been starving, the children who had been afraid, the moment he gave a little girl a chocolate bar and saw her smile for the first time. "That's what I remember," he would say. "Not the battles, not the medals, just that smile. That's what the war was really about, getting to the point where a kid could smile again." The headman of Shimabuku lived until 1978. In his final years, he spoke often of the winter of 1946, the trucks that arrived with food, the moment he realized that survival was possible. He never forgot the propaganda, the lies his government had told him, the years he spent believing that death was preferable to defeat. But he also never forgot the American sergeant who handed him a sack of rice and asked for nothing in return. "I learned," he told his grandchildren, "that the world is more complicated than they teach you, and that sometimes the enemy is more human than your own leaders." The cans, rusted and dented, remained in Shimabuku for decades. Some were buried in middens, archaeologists of a strange era. Others were repurposed again and again, their labels faded beyond recognition, their utility outlasting their origin. In the 1960s, when Okinawa was still under American administration, a historian visiting the village found a stack of them in a storage shed. He asked the elderly shopkeeper if he remembered where they came from. The man, who had been a child in 1946, nodded. "The Americans brought them," he said. "When we were starving, they saved us." The historian asked if he resented the occupation, the foreign control that lingered long after the war ended. The shopkeeper paused, then shrugged. "I resent the war," he said. "The occupation gave us food." This pragmatic acceptance, neither love nor hatred but a recognition of complexity, became characteristic of post-war Okinawa. The island bore the scars of the battle, hundreds of thousands of dead, landscapes transformed by bombardment, a population traumatized by violence. But it also bore the memory of survival, of the moment when aid arrived, when the expected apocalypse gave way to something stranger, the possibility of rebuilding. The abundance that the Americans represented was not merely material. It was ideological. The United States, whatever its flaws and contradictions, projected a vision of society where individuals could thrive, where dissent was tolerated, where the state existed to serve the people rather than the reverse. This vision, transmitted through cans of food and the casual generosity of young soldiers, took root in Japan in ways that no amount of military force could have achieved. The democracy imposed by the occupation was, at first, a foreign imposition resented by conservatives and nationalists. But over time, as the benefits became clear, land reform, labor rights, women's suffrage, economic growth, it was embraced, adapted, and made Japanese. The symbolism of the can, then, is the symbolism of a container, something that preserves, protects, and delivers sustenance across time and distance. The American abundance was not infinite. The post-war years saw economic struggles, rationing, and inequality. But compared to the deprivation of wartime Japan, it was miraculous. And the miracle was not just the food, but the idea that food could be shared, that the enemy could be fed, that victory did not require annihilation.